the most powerful queen of the ancient world, a woman who dared to challenge. Rome spending her final days locked inside a bare stone chamber, not in chains, not in violence, but in silence designed to break her mind. History claims Cleopatra chose a peaceful death. That story is wrong. What happened instead was a calculated psychological operation, executed by Rome to destroy her before she was allowed to die. This is not a tale of poison or myth. It is a story about power, humiliation, and a final decision that threatened an empire. Today, we reveal the truth history buried. The triumph that terrified queens. Rome did not fear Cleopatra because she was defeated. Rome feared her because she understood exactly what victory meant in Roman hands, and that knowledge was more dangerous than any army she had commanded. Long before the doors of her chamber were sealed, long before Octavian's guards stood outside, listening to the soft movement of silk on stone, Cleopatra already knew the ending Rome intended for her, because she had witnessed it with her own eyes years earlier, standing in the heart of the empire that would one day destroy her. In Rome, victory was never private, never merciful, and never complete until it was performed. The Roman triumph was not a celebration. It was a ritual of domination designed to rewrite reality itself. A defeated enemy was stripped of complexity, dignity, and humanity, transformed into a living symbol dragged through cheering crowds, so the state could declare that chaos had been mastered and foreign threat erased. Cleopatra remembered the smell of the streets during Caesar's triumph, the way the crowd roared not in joy, but in hunger, craving the sight of a fallen king paraded like an animal, knowing that at the end of the route awaited a small stone chamber beneath the Capitoline Hill, where execution was not justice but punctuation. She understood that chains were only the beginning, that humiliation was the true weapon, that survival inside a triumph was temporary and conditional, because Rome demanded not just submission, but spectacle. That was why Octavian did not rush to kill her. Death alone would have denied him the story he needed to tell. A dead queen could become a martyr. A living one could be reshaped into proof. Rome needed its people to believe they had not torn themselves apart in civil war, but had been saved from a foreign seductress and Eastern corruption, a queen who dared to rival Roman order. Cleopatra knew how myths were manufactured, how crowds were instructed where to place their hatred, and she knew that once her image entered that parade, it would never belong to her again. Her voice would be replaced by chance, her intelligence by caricature, her reign by a single image fixed forever in Roman memory. This was why every hour she remained alive was an act of resistance, and every breath an unbearable calculation. The triumph terrified queens because it offered no escape, no honorable defeat, no dignified end, only the slow erasure of identity beneath the weight of applause. Cleopatra understood that Rome did not merely conquer territories. It conquered narratives, and she was now the final chapter Octavian needed to write his ascent. As she waited inside stone walls, hearing guards shift their weight outside, she was not imagining death. She was imagining Rome, its streets, its crowds, its chains, and the certainty that once she stepped into that procession, the woman known as Cleopatra would cease to exist, replaced by a symbol designed to justify empire itself. The chamber was the weapon. The chamber where Cleopatra was held was never meant to kill her, only to unmake her, because Rome understood that breaking a ruler's will was far more valuable than ending her life. It was a second-floor room chosen with intention, elevated enough to isolate her from the ground, yet close enough to the palace corridors. That sound could travel just far enough to torment, but never comfort. The walls were bare stone, stripped of color and ornament, denying her the symbols of power that had defined her reign, while the single narrow window admitted light without offering escape or reminder that the world still existed just beyond reach. Guards stood outside at all hours, not threatening, not cruel, but relentlessly present, a living boundary that reduced the Queen of Egypt to a watched object. Every morning they searched her body with professional indifference, fingers combing through her hair, checking seams of cloth, examining her mouth and hands, not out of hatred but procedure, because Octavian's orders were absolute. She must not die. This was the inversion of mercy, preservation used as punishment, survival enforced as captivity. Cleopatra understood the cruelty immediately. Death would have given her control, a final act of sovereignty. But life under Rome's conditions was something else entirely, a slow erosion where choice disappeared one decision at a time. She was not interrogated, not beaten, not shouted at. Instead, silence did the work. Hours passed unmarked, meals arrived without conversation, and the absence of information became its own violence. She did not know what Octavian was planning, what Rome believed, or what was happening to her children. And in that uncertainty, her imagination became the enemy. The mind, deprived of clarity, fills the void with fear, and Rome relied on that instinct with precision. Cleopatra began to understand that this room was not confinement but rehearsal, a space designed to condition her for what was coming, to teach her that resistance was futile and endurance pointless. Each day she remained alive under guard, reinforced the message that her body no longer belonged to her, that even death required permission. Somewhere beyond those walls, Octavian was shaping the story he would tell the Roman people, and she knew that her suffering now was part of that narrative's foundation. The longer she endured, the more Rome could claim restraint, patience, moral authority. Yet beneath that calculation was something colder still. Time itself was being weaponized. With each passing day, the idea of the triumph grew more real, more detailed, more unavoidable. Cleopatra was being held not between life and death, but between dignity and degradation, and Rome intended to make sure she understood that the triumph was inevitable. The chamber did not need chains or bars, because its true function was psychological design, to convince the last Pharaoh of Egypt that the future had already been decided, and that all she could choose now was how long she would suffer before being displayed to the world. Bloodlines as leverage, Cleopatra understood power better than most rulers, because she had lived among men who disguised domination as law, and when Octavian turned his attention to her children, she recognized the strategy immediately. This was no longer about conquest, but compliance. Empires did not merely destroy enemies. They absorbed futures, rewrote bloodlines, and decided which names would be allowed to survive history. Her children were no longer heirs or innocents, but variables in a political equation that Octavian intended to solve with precision. Removed from her sight and scattered across the palace under guard, they became instruments of pressure, their safety transformed into conditional currency. No threats were spoken aloud, because they did not need to be. The message arrived calmly, delivered through polished messengers who spoke in measured tones, informing her that the children were being well cared for, that their fate depended on her cooperation, and that certain bloodlines carried unavoidable risks in a world ruled by Rome. Cleopatra did not need elaboration. She knew that her eldest son, Caesarion, was not merely a boy, but a living contradiction to Octavian's authority, a reminder that Julius Caesar had a biological heir whose existence alone challenged the legitimacy of the new order. As long as Cleopatra lived, Caesarion lived. If she died, Rome would no longer need to pretend restraint. This knowledge turned survival into a trap. For the first time, death ceased to be a solution and became a threat, because dying would abandon her children to men who had already decided their worth. Rome had found the one pressure point she could not harden herself against: motherhood weaponized by empire. Each day that followed tightened the vice. Reports were delivered selectively, always incomplete, designed to provoke hope without offering certainty. A son asked after her. A daughter was heard laughing somewhere nearby. Were these truths or performances? Cleopatra could not know, and that ambiguity was intentional. By denying her information, Octavian ensured that every possibility remained alive in her mind, forcing her to imagine outcomes far worse than anything confirmed. She asked to see them and was refused, told that such meetings required trust, cooperation, and patience. In that delay, Rome asserted its control over time itself, stretching anticipation into agony. The cruelty lay not in violence, but in dependence. Cleopatra, who had negotiated with senators and commanded fleets, now relied on her captors for news of her own children, reduced to interpreting fragments and tone for meaning. The psychological balance shifted subtly but decisively. The woman who once shaped destinies was now reacting to them. Octavian did not need to threaten execution. The implication was enough. Every choice Cleopatra considered led back to the same impossible conflict: protect her children by surrendering her dignity, or preserve her sovereignty by condemning them to an uncertain fate. This was Rome's most effective weapon, not the sword or the chain, but the deliberate construction of a moral dilemma so cruel that any decision felt like betrayal, ensuring that whatever path she chose, she would be broken before the triumph ever began. The architecture of humiliation. By the time the architects entered Cleopatra's chamber, she understood that Rome had moved from coercion to certainty, because empires only measure what they fully intend to use. They arrived without ceremony, carrying rods, wax tablets, and lengths of cord, men trained not in cruelty, but in calculation, their professionalism making the act far more terrifying than open brutality. They did not ask permission. They observed, noted, and began to reduce the living queen into dimensions, angles, and proportions, discussing her body as if it were already part of a structure yet to be unveiled. Height, shoulder width, the fall of her posture when she stood for too long without food. They spoke in neutral voices, debating visibility and spacing, where the crowd's eyes would settle. How far chains should hang without obscuring the face. Cleopatra realized then that the triumph was no longer an abstract threat. It was being engineered around her presence, designed to extract maximum effect from her survival. Rome was not planning to kill her in a moment of rage or fear. Rome was designing an experience. Each day they returned, refining details, repeating measurements, revisiting decisions as though polishing a work of art. They discussed garments that would read as foreign to Roman crowds, ornaments recognizable enough to evoke wealth, but restrained enough to signal defeat. Whether iron would be necessary, or whether the absence of chains would be more effective, suggesting submission rather than force. They debated humiliation as a visual language, and they did it in front of her, ensuring that she understood every implication. This was not preparation. It was conditioning. By exposing her to the mechanics of her own degradation, Rome sought to exhaust her resistance, to make the future so vividly imagined that it would eclipse the present. Cleopatra's silence became a battlefield. She refused to react, knowing that emotion would only feed the process. Yet the effort required to remain composed drained what little strength she had left. The chamber that once confined her now functioned as a workshop, a place where her identity was being dismantled piece by piece. Outside, guards reported her every movement, her appetite, her posture, the way her gaze lingered on the floor. Data points fed into Octavian's broader design. He did not need to be present. His intent saturated the room. Cleopatra understood that the triumph required her alive, not for mercy, but for legitimacy. Her humiliation would cleanse Rome's civil bloodshed, transforming a war between Romans into a victory over the East, a narrative simple enough to satisfy the masses. The architects left each day without cruelty, without apology, because in Rome's logic, this was not personal. It was structural. As their footsteps faded down the corridor, Cleopatra was left alone with the realization that death had been delayed only so that her living body could serve as the final monument to Octavian's power, and that the cage being built around her was not stone or iron, but inevitability itself. The offer that was never real. When Octavian finally entered Cleopatra's chamber, The balance of power did not shift because it had already been decided. His presence merely confirmed what the silence had been preparing her to accept. He did not arrive as a conqueror flushed with victory, nor as an executioner eager for blood, but as a man presenting himself as reasonable, controlled, and inevitable. His voice, according to those who later reconstructed the meeting, was calm and deliberate, stripped of threat, because threats were unnecessary at this stage. He spoke of order, of Rome's need for closure, of the stability that would follow cooperation, framing surrender not as defeat, but as responsibility. Cleopatra listened without interruption, understanding that every word was crafted to offer her something she wanted, just enough to keep her alive. He promised dignity within humiliation, survival within submission, and protection for her children within captivity. Walk freely in the triumph, he suggested, not dragged in chains. Let the people see restraint, not resistance. In exchange, Rome would show mercy. It was an offer built to sound humane, designed to transform her endurance into apparent consent. Cleopatra recognized the structure immediately. This was not negotiation. It was theater. Octavian needed her agreement, not because he lacked power, but because consent would absolve him in the eyes of Rome. If she appeared willing, her humiliation could be framed as justice rather than cruelty, and the empire could claim moral authority over its own brutality. Yet beneath the polished language lay a single unspoken truth. Caesarion. Her eldest son was mentioned only obliquely, described as delicate, politically complex, in need of careful handling, phrases that translated into one certainty Cleopatra could not ignore. His survival depended on her continued usefulness. The moment she ceased to serve Rome's narrative, his life would be forfeit. Octavian did not need to say this aloud. The implication was enough. Cleopatra asked for time, and Octavian granted it, because time itself favored him. 3 days, he said, after which preparations would continue regardless of her decision. This was the illusion of choice, a pause designed to feel merciful while reinforcing inevitability. Alone again, Cleopatra understood the cruelty of the offer. To live meant to submit publicly, to endure degradation so complete that it would erase her reign, her intellect, and her legacy, all in the name of saving her children. To die meant surrendering them to Rome's mercy, a mercy she did not trust. For days, she existed between hope and despair, clinging to the possibility that sacrifice might still yield protection, that endurance could be transformed into survival for those she loved. But as the hours passed, the cracks in the promise widened. Rome had never spared threats to its authority, and Caesarion was the greatest threat of all. Slowly, painfully, Cleopatra began to understand that the offer was not a path forward, but a holding pattern, a way to keep her compliant until Rome no longer needed her alive. What Octavian had presented as mercy was simply delay, and the realization that her cooperation would change nothing marked the moment when hope itself became another instrument of control. The only victory left by the morning, Cleopatra made her final decision. The illusion had collapsed completely, leaving only clarity sharpened by despair, because once she understood that Rome would kill Caesarion regardless of her obedience, the moral equation Octavian had constructed lost its power. Survival no longer protected her children. It merely prolonged her usefulness as a symbol, and humiliation would not purchase mercy from an empire that eliminated threats as a matter of policy. When she asked to visit Antony's tomb, the request sounded harmless, even reasonable. A grieving queen paying respects before an inevitable departure, and Octavian allowed it because he believed control had already been achieved. Under heavy guard, she entered the tomb she had built as a fortress against death, the place where Antony's blood had stained the stone, and there, surrounded by silence and memory, Cleopatra reclaimed the one thing Rome had been systematically stripping from her: agency. What happened inside that hour was not witnessed, not recorded, not measured by Roman architects, but its consequences would echo through history. When she returned to her chamber, she asked for a meal, specifically figs, a simple request that carried no obvious threat, and the guards, trained to search for weapons rather than intention, allowed it through. Rome believed it had eliminated every method of escape, but it had misunderstood the nature of the struggle. Cleopatra did not seek death because she feared suffering. She chose it because it was the last act Rome could not choreograph. Whatever the precise method, whatever truth was later softened into myth, the reality was stark. Cleopatra denied Octavian the spectacle he needed. There would be no living queen dragged through Rome, no foreign temptress displayed to cleanse civil bloodshed, no triumph completed through ritualized degradation. When the guards finally entered her chamber, they found not a broken captive, but a ruler who had ended the contest on her own terms. Rome responded as empires always do when denied narrative control. It simplified, romanticized, and obscured. The story of the asp, the peaceful death, the loyal attendants, these were not facts, but conveniences designed to dull the sharp edge of what had actually occurred. The truth was more unsettling. Cleopatra's death was not an act of despair, but a calculated refusal to participate in Rome's machinery of domination. By dying when and how she did, she transformed herself from a prop in Octavian's triumph into a problem history could never fully resolve. Rome won Egypt, seized its wealth, and absorbed its legacy, but it failed to claim her body as proof of moral victory. In the end, Cleopatra lost her kingdom, her children, and her life. Yet she denied empire its most coveted prize, the power to define her final image. That is why her death was made to look gentle, why its horror was buried beneath legend, and why, more than 2,000 years later, the last pharaoh of Egypt still unsettles the empires that replaced Rome, reminding us that even in defeat, control over one's ending can be the most dangerous form of resistance.